Yeah. So I was watching a Karolina Zebrowska video the other day. She posted one up maybe a week ago or something by the time I post this up. And she was buying costumes on Wish. It was that video. And she said, like, oh, people always ask how to get into historical costuming for cheap. And, honestly, you just can't. You just need to save up for the pieces and the things that you want. And I have not stopped thinking about it since. Like, I saw that like on Friday. It's the following Saturday, and it's still like in my head because there's so much stuff you can do to get into, particularly like history bounding, which I think probably is where a lot of people want to kind of start their historical costuming journey and see if they want it, that you can do for free or for very cheap. And people shouldn't be discouraged about that. And I think maybe when you get really far in, it's how do I do something which looks exactly like something that Karolina might produce herself, or Morgan Donna makes, or Bernadette Banner, or anyone like that, where it's actually, yeah, it's got a lot of materials and it's got a lot of finishing and all of these other things, but you don't need to, like, you didn't start there. Like, Karolina herself probably did not start there, and I feel like she's probably maybe forgotten some of the things that she did like early days. But yeah, you can get started with loads of stuff. So I just wanted to put out some of the things that you could do for free if you're interested in getting into historical costuming or history bounding or kind of dressing more vintage. The first thing that I thought of is you can style your hair vintage. This is something that I tried out a couple of times. Your hair is already on your head, it's free. So you can cut your hair into slightly more historical lengths if you have a particular idea of what you want. So you can have long hair, which is quite nice for medieval, and it's kind of the Edwardian, Victorian sort of braids and things like that. You could cut it a bit shorter if like you're sort of into more 1940s, 50s, 20s even, like they kind of have their hair a lot shorter. Morgan Donna has a fantastic video called like 500 Years of Hair, where she's cutting her hair as part of it. So she shows like this is how to cut all of it, which is not necessarily a bad place to start if you're either cutting your own hair or whatever. But even that, you can curl your hair. Like, curling your hair instantly makes it look vintage. Do a victory roll. You need like your finger and a couple of hairpins. You probably already have those, and if not, you can probably find the 20p or whatever you need to buy some hairpins. You can borrow some, and I think that just instantly makes every outfit look more vintage. If you're thinking about trying to give advice for like all eras, but blouses, wearing a blouse with a long skirt looks vintage. That kind of looks vaguely Edwardian. If you think about the kind of things that Bernadette Banner wears, she's wearing like a skirt that goes down to her ankle and a blouse that is done up to here. And that will give you a lot already, and you can probably find that in your own wardrobe. Maybe you can borrow it from your mum or your sister or someone like that. Or you can, yeah, oh my gosh. You can find stuff in charity shops as well and style it a little bit vintage. Maybe one of the things I got in a charity shop, not even trying to be vintage, but I wore it when I needed to look like the 1950s, was like a little jumper with short sleeves. And I put it on and I made some little pointy bits to put in my bra, and it looked kind of like a bullet bra. And I looked sort of 1950s, and it was enough for what I needed for the time I had to dress up for 1950s for something over the Jubilee weekend. So styling stuff, a hairscarf is the other thing that I thought of, which is really easy to just tie round your head, and you can borrow one. And even if you're thinking about like borrowing clothes, like, how old is your mum? How old do you have a good relationship with your grandma? Maybe there are a couple of pieces where you go, I'm interested in kind of dressing more into this style. Is there anything in your wardrobe I can borrow? Or maybe even have, because grandmas love you and will maybe give you pieces. And if you're a guy, because I realised this was all very like femme sort of based, wearing formal wear in the day will make you look more vintage. Like, I had a friend who really wanted to look more kind of vintage as part of their look, and went to a charity shop, managed to find a whole load of waistcoats, a fantastic find, and would wear them in the middle of the day, a waistcoat and a cravat and a suit jacket, and that instantly, it just looked more vintage because that was the way that people used to like dress themselves. So like just being a little bit more formalized around dress, like dress has got kind of more and more casual, will instantly make you look more vintage and will instantly give you a history bounding look, even if everything you are wearing is modern, even if everything you're wearing is from Primark and H&M and is just stuff that you already have, you will instantly look more vintage. And it'll give you that kind of historical costuming spice, like a little flavour of it, and you can bring that in kind of day to day. The other thing which I've kind of already mentioned is charity shops. So you can just find things in there which are generally a bit cheaper, and maybe you can start dipping in a little bit with sewing skills. You don't need to have a lot of sewing skills to start doing some little thrift flips. So if you get a regular blouse, maybe you can go and get also a piece of lace, either from something else that you found in the charity shop, or haberdasheries tend to do it really, really cheap, like ribbons and lace and things like that. You can maybe attach that to something that you've got. So if you've got a shirt with a collar, a little bit of lace underneath will maybe give it a bit of a different look. It just sort of depends on the styles that you want, but there might be small modifications that you can make, like pulling up a shoulder a little bit to make it look a little bit more puffed. Will give you something that looks a little bit more Edwardian and that kind of thing. Maybe you can't find long skirts, but you can find a long dress, and maybe you feel confident enough to cut the top off and just turn it into a skirt. So you've got a lot of options there for like very cheap ways to get outfits. So we've got kind of the free versions of like styling your hair, styling the clothes that you already have, buying some cheap additional pieces, grabbing some accessories, and charity shops or thrift stores are a good place to get old things. You can go and get maybe some sort of brooch or something that is just a little bit more old-fashioned, it's a little bit more grandma, and that will give you kind of an older look instantly for really cheap. You don't have to like be making 17th century ball gowns in order to kind of get a little bit of a vintage vibe. And the other thing I thought of is, although there's like the big saying is vintage styles, not vintage values, and I think that's very, very true for things like racism and homophobia. But what maybe some of the other values that you could bring through is things like mending clothes. So something that might sort of start to kind of make your heart sing is thinking about acting in way, looking after your clothes in the way that our ancestors would have, or in the way that our like the older generations would. So learning how to do some basic mending can possibly give you some of that feeling of it sort of feeling old-fashioned, a little bit connected to the past. Because I think a lot of people today, if they have clothes that have a hole in, they'll just throw them away. Clothing is cheap, it's easily available. But actually maybe that wasn't the case for people a couple of generations back, and it's definitely not the case for like my grandparents who went through the war, and my parents who experienced rationing and things like that. So sewing buttons back on, like learning how to do that and having some of that and having a little handkerchief and stuff might give you enough of a feeling that actually even if all of your clothes are modern, you still feel like you're treating them with a slightly sort of vintage style. And the other thing is that there might be other historical things that make your heart sing. So something that I really like is old books, and you can go and find old books in your library. And if you don't have easy and free access to a library, which, I mean, if you're in the UK, you're probably not far from one at any point because we're quite sort of a small area, but if you're in America or don't have sort of easy access to get places, your library probably has ebooks, so check that out. With the library that I'm with, there's a company called BorrowBox that they're like signed up to, and they have ebooks and audiobooks, so you can find pieces of classic literature, like maybe reading some Dickens will give you that kind of historical feeling of that kind of, I don't know when Dickens was writing, I don't like Dickens, but maybe you do. But like reading old books, I read a book, and like knowing about historical fashion, I read Wilkie Collins' Woman in White, which I really love, and there was a point where this woman makes a creaking noise as she curtsies, and someone says that it must be her stays. And if I didn't know about historical fashion, I wouldn't have known what that was. So actually reading that was a little bit of that, oh, I know what that is. And I might not have done if I'd read this 2 years before because I didn't know anything about historical fashion. So it might be that old books bring you that joy, classic literature. quite a lot of it is now out of copyright, so it's available online for free, and tends to be sort of widely available, especially if you're looking for things sort of within the canon. So like Charles Dickens and like authors and people that have all sort of been known about, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, that kind of thing. It's going to be set way back, but also it's going to give you that time where it's set in a different time, and maybe there's industrialization that's kind of just happened, or pre-industrialization. And another place which you can find amazingly, archive.org. It's got like books on it for free, and because they're all things that are kind of outside of copyright because they're so old, it's just got them up as available as a PDF, so you can download them. You can sometimes put them on things like e-reader apps. I use one called Book Fusion, which I find pretty good. You can put a couple of books on there, and then that'll keep stuff kind of across devices. Sometimes you can put things sort of into Kindle that way as well. So reading old books can kind of give you that same kind of connection to the past that sort of dressing in a historical style might. So I really like the circus. So I've been reading a whole load of circus autobiographies that are available, and I now know so much about lion taming, which isn't gonna help me. But like, I know it, and I really enjoyed reading the book about the lion tamer and what was P.T. Barnum like. And there's some really beautiful moments where it was like a quote in one of them. It wasn't the lion tamer, it was Jules the clown, and he said something like, "Oh, this is the slapstick and the pratfall and the jokes have been the concept of clowning for the past 100 years, and I expect they will be for the next 100 years too." And I realised as I was reading it was 110 years after that had been published, and it was still the same. It was still relatable, and it was amazing to have that link that all this time has passed, and yet that little aspect of circus, it was still the same. They were still describing the kind of tents that I've been in to go and watch the circus. So there's something really glorious about that, and that's available for free on the internet. You can just go and read it, and no one will stop you. Maybe someone will stop you, but like, you know, it's fine, it's free, and you can do it in your own house, so it's really accessible. And the other thing I thought of, which is a little bit wilder, and we are getting further and further away from dressing like you're from the past, but is old people. I was doing a couple of jobs where I was tending to work with slightly older people, sort of in a healthcare setting. And the demographic of people in one of the services that I was working for were much older, and they all talked about their past, because they grew up in the 1930s or 40s or 50s, and all of the styles that we're really interested in they experienced firsthand. And there are a lot of old people that are very lonely in the world at the moment, and you could go and find them and talk to them. So if you do a Google search for like your town and befriending service, you can probably find like your local care home, and you can go and talk to an old person, and you can befriend them, you can become their friend, and it prevents them from being lonely. And you can ask them every piece of like first-hand information. Be like, "Oh, I'm really interested in fashion from the 1960s. Like, do you have any experiences of that?" And the danger of this is you meet someone and they're like, "I was born in 1973. What the fuck are you talking about?" But even if that was the case, it might be that actually it's something that their mum always like dressed in, or their dad always like dressed in, or had like some really strong connection to. So you can go and get all these first-hand experiences about whatever it is about history that's really interesting to you in a way that really, really benefits the person that you're talking to. Like, it doesn't have to be a big interview, but like the more you engage with things kind of from that era, the more you can use that as a way to bring up talking points. Like, even if you're watching documentaries and period dramas, I started a conversation with one of my friends who was quite involved in music in like the 1970s and the 1980s. And I said, "Oh, watch this documentary about this person. Like, did you like them when you were younger? What were your experiences? Did you ever go and see them live?" And we had a really great conversation about that, because like, yeah, he had, and he'd loved them, and the first time he'd heard them and how it inspired his own music and things like that. It was really, really interesting. And it's just a conversation you can't have with somebody that was like me, also born in the 90s or even later. So yeah, that's just like an extra thing for if you're sort of interested in history. There are probably people around you that can just tell you more about history kind of firsthand. You don't even need to go that far to look at it, and in a way that will be lovely for them, because old people get lonely and it's a service that places are starting to offer. And maybe you can also learn to knit, and you can go and join a knitter natter group and hear all of the amazing birth stories I've heard for being in the local knitter natter group in the local library before the pandemic. So yeah, there are some really amazing things out there in the world, and there are probably some really amazing historical outfits that are hiding in your wardrobe that are just waiting for you to pin curl your hair, leave it in overnight, tie on a scarf, put on some red lipstick and your mum's long skirt, and turn it into an amazing vintage outfit. Do not listen to Karolina Zebrowska when she tells you that everything has to be expensive when it comes to historical costuming, but do go and watch all of her other videos because she is an amazing content creator. She was just wrong about this one thing. I think she's been into the sewing for too long. Anyway, hope you have a great day and aren't bothered by anything that I said in this video for the next 8 days and have to make your own responses. And remember, you can always keep a lot of rubles in a dead rat. Laters.